We have often spoken about the critical need for different viewpoints in technology. Most companies you look at these days have diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, but it is often easier said than done. Today, we're going to be talking about how to bring it all together and how to learn from our mistakes. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome back to another Future Tech video podcast. The audio version of the podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most of the others, or you can find it at futr.buzzsprout.com. We are talking with Sejal Thakkar, who is the Chief Civility Officer at her company, TrainXtra. She bills herself as a legal training ninja, TEDx speaker, and Master Juggler. And we are going to hear about her journey and what makes her passionate about social justice and how she helps companies pursue a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. Welcome, Sejal.
Thank you, Chris and Sandesh. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the unfolding tragedy in India. It's quite a tragic scene, and what I will do is post some links if people want to donate and help. PBS has some great links. I'm going to post those links in the link to that article. So if you feel that you want to help, that's a good way to do it. So after that, I know that's sort of a downer start, but so tell me a little bit about your personal journey and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, so, I've been an employment law attorney in California since about 2003, originally born and raised in Chicago, and I moved to the Bay Area in 2000. And yes, I did it for the reason we all do when we leave Chicago, is because it's cold and I had to get away from there. But I've been in California ever since. I've been from about 2003 till about 8 years ago, I was actually in court representing management on cases that dealt with harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. And about 3 years ago, in November of 2017, I decided that I wanted to start my own company and proactively help organizations before the lawsuits filed so that we can actually create better work cultures. So that's what I've been doing. I've been facilitating workshops and trainings to organizations around the globe. Prior to COVID, I was doing all my trainings in person, and then now I'm doing everything virtually. As far as my journey goes leading up to law school, like I said, I was born and raised in Chicago. Being a lawyer was something I always knew I was going to do. So my undergraduate degree is accounting, but I always, I was double majored, accounting and finance. And I decided, I'm going to go to law school anyway. So let's drop finance, do the accounting and get going. So that's just a little bit of my professional history.
So what made you so passionate about what you do?
I've always had a social justice aspect to me. I've always wanted to help create better work environments. We spend so much time at work. The last thing we want is to be at work, deal with harassment, deal with microaggressions. I think most people want to go to work. They want to work, be a part of a team. They want to be successful. And so what I saw as an attorney was we were waiting too late. We were waiting till a lawsuit was filed, a complaint was filed, and only dealing with sort of the legally protected categories and issues rather than focusing more on creating cultures of dignity and respect. And so that's really just my passion. What I saw as an attorney also drives me starting my own company, because a lot of times, and there were some cases where I worked on where I saw people that were being malicious or intentional in wanting to harm other people. But honestly, what I saw more of was people just not having the knowledge, ignorance, not understanding how to respond in certain situations. And because of that lack of education or training, we were then ending up in court. So I really made it my mission to say, let's give people these skills. We need to understand how to get along, how to see each other's perspectives, how to resolve conflict, how to have difficult conversations. I guess some people call them the soft skills. But when we throw a bunch of people together that are all different from each other, we then need to give them the skills to be able to get along as well. So that's what I do a lot of right now.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, the world has changed a lot over the years. I mean, I think we have a greater awareness of these issues. But I think one of the challenges is that we've, as a society, become so polarized that I think the message sometimes gets lost because people just say, "Oh, this is woke culture" or whatever, and some of that is just getting diluted, and that's really unfortunate.
I agree. It's true. And that's really where the work has to be done, is getting everybody to the middle ground. We don't want to leave anybody behind. It's not about canceling people or shaming people or judging people. It's really about how do we move forward and correct our systems so that they're fair and that we can get justice for everybody, because the systems need to be dismantled. There's no question about that. But how do we do that in a way where everybody feels included? Because the bottom line is we can't leave anybody behind. This won't work. We won't be able to make the progress that we want to make until we understand, and sort of going back to, the vocabulary, certain words are buzzwords. And when people hear them, they start to get all defensive and they don't want to do the work. But the bottom line is we all have to individually start with ourselves and figure out what we can do to interact with people, especially those that are different than us. That's where a lot of these problems stem, is when you've got diversity in the mix. And now people, when you have different people, regardless of what the differences are, inherent in that is going to be some conflict. There are going to be issues that are going to come up. And so I saw this over and over again where people didn't understand what to do when they were trying to navigate through those challenges that come along with diversity.
Yeah. Well, and we had a conversation about this with Ravi Patel in the context of, like how this polarization sort of killed comedy, because you can't assume that, that some things are coming from a place of good intent anymore because of the polarization. And I think that just drives a lot more tension for everybody.
I think this is a tough time right now because of the events that have happened, especially this last year. Mm-hmm. Fear, bias is at an all-time high. People don't feel safe. So when you don't have psychological safety, you have to be really careful about what you're saying, whether your intention is to harm somebody or whether your intention is to be funny. I think it's just a matter of deciding what is the degree of risk you're willing to take that it might offend somebody. And again, I've been saying this for years, and the law, recognizes that intent is really not what's relevant to this conversation. It really is about the impact that those comments, that those behaviors are having on people because of their lived experience. And so I say this over and over again when I'm working with leaders and supervisors. Intention, we don't really look at intention. We really look at the impact. And so the best thing you can do when you're being called in about something you might have said and that might have been offensive to somebody is to listen and accept that that is the impact, and then change your behavior. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's funny. I think at the end of the day, if you have a question, if you should say something, maybe you should probably just not say it at this point. I
don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, Chris.
Yeah.
I think that as a society, what we've done is we've said you can't ask these questions. You can't talk about this. That creates a bigger problem than us actually getting into that uncomfortable territory and dealing with that question or conversation, even if it's difficult or challenging, and it might hurt some people's feelings or it might trigger some people. It's better to have those conversations, because here's the thing. We can't on one hand be saying that we want you to be able to bring your authentic self to work because we want you to be who you are. We can't on one hand say that and then on the other hand say, but don't talk about X, Y, and Z when you're at work, because That doesn't work, right? So
Yeah.
I would say ask the question, but think about how you're asking the question, where you're asking the question, the mode of communication, whether you're being respectful and professional, whether you're doing it in a way that's meant to be fostering a debate, not a debate, but a dialogue, right? So this is going back to, again, helping people, empowering people with those skills so they can, because let's say if the three of us were working together, and there is safety and we have a trust and rapport between the three of us, you should feel safe saying, hey, Sejal, the joke that you made, rubbed me the wrong way. You should feel safe saying that to me. And my response wouldn't be to defend myself. It wouldn't be to say, Chris, come on, you're just being sensitive, It would be to really listen to how it impacted you and then not make that joke again.
Yeah.
It's really not that difficult.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is a good point. I mean, avoiding the conversation isn't going to solve the problem. No, and I got to say, like Sundish, we have this issue all the time because we talk to people that, make really just profoundly racist comments that just really, I mean, to me, it just like shocks me, I mean, but Sundish, he's kind of grown up with it. And so it's not as unusual to him. But when I see it, it's like, whoa.
Yeah. Just like Sejal, I grew up with it, so you develop a certain kind of, tolerance to it, right? To the point, truth be told, as embarrassing as this is, I was trying so hard to fit in and be part of the Western culture that, I pronounced my name Sandish instead of Sundish because it was just easier and it seemed like people could say it better. And then they would call me Dish. Because they're like, oh, Sandish, Dish. And then that was like my nickname. I'm like, hey, this is pretty cool. Look, I'm now part of the crew. But that really messes with you, right? So like after a while, as I got older, I started making jokes. I started like that. I saw this defense mechanism where it's like, hey, if I make these Indian jokes, these white people really love it. I could do this all day. All I got to do is just tell them stories about my family and they find it hilarious. So, that's the way that like, I think Sejal and I kind of grew up with it. But now, like graduating from college and everything else, now I'm saying my name is Sundish. I introduce myself as Sundish. So like some of my college buddies are like, what'd you just say? It's like, well, I'm trying to go back to my roots. And now these conversations are happening more and more. And so I got to tell you, even for me, it's awkward, like I don't want to create a situation around this, but this is why I think this conversation is really interesting. Sejal's saying that we should just have a conversation and we should be able to talk to each other, where I still am at that point where Chris will say, can you believe that guy said that to you? And I'll say, yeah, it's all right. He's misunderstood, and I just want to keep kind of going forward. I don't know. I got to get better.
Yeah, well, but my white privilege kicks in, and I'm like, you shouldn't stand for that,
And here's the thing about the whole white privilege thing too. It's look, we all have some kind of privilege, right? It's just the way I define privilege is that we have an advantage over other people, right? I mean, I'm privileged because I was born here versus an Indian person that was born in India, right? I mean, we all have some advantages. Right now, I'm using my privilege and my voice to give a voice to the marginalized, to give them representation, right? So I think that's another word that's, when we say white privilege or, and I'm not saying it just divides people and rather than bringing people together. Now, that being said, I remember the situation where there was a guy that posted, on LinkedIn when everything was blowing up last year after the George Floyd situation happened. And this white guy posted like in an email, like pretty soon after it happened, 20 privileges that he had. I was privileged to be in the Navy and the Army. I was privileged to do this. I was privileged to do this. And he conveniently left out his white privilege. Right. And so I saw that and I just very respectfully made a comment and saying, yeah, and you forgot one, the obvious one, which is hard to do. It's easy to do sometimes. And I pointed it out. Now, anybody who did forget or didn't, would have just said, oh, you're right. And then they amended their post and we would have moved on. This guy went on and it was like, it blew up. It went like 120 messages deep and he kept defending it. And just because I'm white doesn't mean I have privilege. And we went down that whole conversation. And it was just one of those situations where, we can educate people to a certain extent, But at some point, you got to just say, okay, we can't change everybody's opinions, but what we can do, especially at work, is change people's behaviors. And that's why, again, I go back to, don't be afraid to have these conversations and do it in the right way, because that's the only way we know what the issues are that we need to address. If we don't, then these issues don't go away.
Yeah.
When somebody makes a bad joke, unless we put that person on notice that it was offensive, they're going to think it's okay. And then they're going to make the joke again and again. And then that issue is going to continue to fester until it becomes a toxic work environment, right? So it's better to deal with these issues early on and recognize that there might be situations where we don't have to agree on everything. We can disagree. We can agree to disagree. It's not about changing everyone's opinion so we all have one opinion. In fact, it's the opposite. What we're doing is we're saying, let's be accepting of everyone's opinions, but we're still going to be civil in how we respond to people. Right. So.
Well, so you talk about civility in the workplace and modifying workplace behavior. There was a really interesting article this week that came out about an event that happened at Basecamp, which was formerly 37 Signals, a Chicago-based company here, and notably always viewed as a fairly progressive company, and the leaders of the company, even wrote management books and that sort of thing. But they had this absolutely disastrous company meeting that saw a third of their employees quit on the spot after the meeting over, some just really bad behavior and, difficult conversations that didn't go correct. That just left a lot of the staff feeling very alienated, very disappointed in the management, and a management that sort of tried to set a high bar for themselves, right? Which makes it even worse at the end of the day. I know you saw that article. I wonder if you might want to comment on like what went wrong there and what was at the core of that.
Yeah, I mean, I read some stuff about that until you sent me that article, Chris. So thank you for sharing that, because I learned a lot more about the details of what went on in there. I think that there were a lot of takeaways that I think I can talk about in that situation to really help other companies be better prepared in how to deal with that. I think the number one thing I would say is that, when you are implementing policies, that's what started the whole thing, was they put out this policy where they said, we don't want people to have certain political or social conversations because it is disruptive to the workplace. Now,
well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just to put a frame around it, they had a list of funny sounding customer names that they had maintained for a very long time.
Totally.
And some employees had mentioned that this is just not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And they had sort of gone to management to say, hey, let's just get rid of this and kind of stop this bad behavior and point out that this is not acceptable behavior. Yeah. So that's sort of what, preceded this event.
Right. So I was going to break it out into two different categories like that. No, that's good, because that issue is a little bit easier to deal with, right, than the policy issue. Right. So I was going to, but so the policy issue is it's and by the way, I've dealt with similar facts, not half of your workforce or a third of your workforce leaving, but I've dealt with situations where companies have wanted to put policies into place like that to prevent certain kinds of conversations, which as a business owner, I can understand, right? We can see. So whether or not the CEO or the leadership there was well-intentioned or not really isn't the issue, because I think most business owners would say these conversations are disruptive, right? Because they do prevent people from doing their job. They can blow up like it did here and et cetera. So I can see the rationale for wanting to do that. But it teaches us a couple different lessons, is that when you are managing change, such as a policy change like that you really need to have a strategy in place, put some thinking about it behind it, put some planning behind it, and really think about what is the intention of the policy, and then what is the impact that this policy is going to have on people. I think you really need to go through that analysis, and I don't know if that was done in this case. So the way that they did the policy here, I'll make a couple of points on that. First of all, my general opinion on policies like that is, again, I've had this issue, I've had this conversation numerous times before this case came out, right? Is that we can't tell people, I mean, you're in my house right now. I'm doing this podcast from home. So much for work-life balance, right? So you're in my house right now. So those rules don't matter anymore. But even if we take that out of the equation, the point is that our personal life, our professional life makes up our identity. So it's about who I am. And so you have to manage understanding that, okay, if we stop this person from being able to bring up these conversations that's intertwined with that person's identity. Right now, we have a lot of Asian hate situations going on. Now, you're asking me, as someone who is Asian, to come to work and be productive and leave those conversations where I have friends and family members that are impacted by what's going on. That's just not something that's reasonable. That's not good practice to have. The conversations are going to happen regardless, right? The bottom line is we're going to do it in the break room, in the coffee room, in the bathroom, in the elevator, and now it's going to be unmanaged. So I think the better approach is to think about how do we create spaces within the organization where we can monitor the behavior, where maybe we put in some parameters around the behavior, where we think about the impact that this is going to have. We set up some clear guidelines on what can be said, what cannot be said, and teach people how to deal with those situations where somebody says something and makes them feel uncomfortable. But I think that that's the problem. And I joke about this a lot these days. I don't even feel like an attorney these days. I feel like a therapist, literally, because people don't have anywhere to talk about these types of issues. We've been told to not bring them to work. Right. Yeah. And so it doesn't work. And it's not just about conversations. Same things with if somebody's dealing with something at home and they're talking about it with a coworker, we need to help people understand what to do with that information, not just say, oh, this is like, for example, somebody's dealing with domestic violence at home. Now they tell a coworker about it. You can't just say it's not my problem, because there's tons of research that says that if somebody's in a domestic violence relationship at home and that other person wants to find you, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to show up at work. Yeah. Right. So we can't just leave things like that at home. And the other part of it, too, is the timing. The timing of when they implemented this policy. First of all, they obviously didn't consider the impact. I know there's been other companies that have tried to do this kind of similar thing. I've even dealt with companies on my own plate that have tried to do it. But I think you have to consider the timing and where we are right now. I mean, it is so much chaos going on that people need a place to talk about it. And so employers need to create that space. And then the other thing I'm going to add about this is that they really did not consider their communication strategy, right? So I want to make sure I make this very clear. So for anybody that's listening to this or watching this podcast, not a good idea to announce policy changes or big decisions like that in a blog, on social media, in your Slack channel. These types of significant changes, like policy changes, like when you're going to take away people's overtime, when you're going to fire somebody, these kind of things probably should be communicated in person by leadership, or, if we can't do in person because of COVID, virtually, but have somebody live. I mean, in this case, they put it down, I think, in their company channel, and that's how people found out about it. And then even afterwards, when they had that meeting where it blew up, even then, I guess one of the leaders had their camera off during, after they made their introduction comments. Like, how do you think that's going to make the employees at that organization feel? Yeah. Right. So there's so many things that happen with the policy. Now, going back to the other piece about having this list where, they kept this list of customer names that were either African-American or Asian sounding. There are so many things wrong with this situation. It doesn't matter what they did as far as from a cultural standpoint to create a better culture, but things like this are going to absolutely make people feel like they're not included. You cannot establish psychological safety when you are intentionally creating a list which is going to alienate your African and Asian employees. You cannot create psychological safety. The reputation to their brand, the fact that they lost their senior leadership, I mean, they violated these customers' privacy rights, by keeping their names and communicating them internally. And then the other thing is, too, then they retaliated against or publicly shamed this person for bringing out these issues. So there were just, again, so many things, missteps that were taken. And then afterwards, this is what led me to starting my company, was afterwards they were like, we're going to bring in some outside help to help us deal with this situation. There is no amount of Band-Aids you can put on this situation to help them recover from that. After the fact, bringing me in is not going to help solve the problem. This is why you want to do it beforehand, right? Yeah. And address these issues. And then there were some other issues too about their DEI efforts, right? They said DEI was a huge, important part of their culture. Okay, where's the actions? Apparently they had like a bunch of people that volunteered to want to be a part of the DEI workforce or ERG, whatever you want to call it, to work on these issues that never went anywhere. They never put any resources behind it. So again, I think we really learned from this case that people's tolerance levels for dealing with incivility, for not making DEI a priority, for not handling these concerns or complaints when they come up in the right way, not investigating it properly, waiting too long, people are going to social media. So this is something every other day we're seeing some new company where some employees getting online, and this is going to get even more. Like, we need to be prepared for this. And it was funny because I looked up another article after you sent me that one. And in the article itself, they put all of the written documentation that was exchanged by Slack, by the within the emails. So now we're communicating through Slack, through emails, through text messages, through social media. This is all permanent evidence that's going to be used against employers. So it doesn't matter if they've done 100 things right, that one thing wrong, one misstep can wipe you out.
Yeah. And you bring up a really important point here. I think that so many companies have done, DEI in just words only, right? I see so many, sometimes companies, diversity efforts mean that they took the picture that was on their homepage and they added a couple people of color to it and put it up and said, we're diverse, right? And I don't think, I think people are saying it because they feel they have to, but they're not doing the work, like you say, right? Yeah. And that's a problem.
And the opposite is a problem too. Not saying it is also a problem. Right. So we're seeing both sides. I'm talking to clients that are employers that are saying our leadership team doesn't want to put out the box and tell people that we're on this side. And I'm like, that's a problem. But then if they do, then that's also. So it's a tough time. And it is a one-on-one factual situation. So there is no everybody, let's put this out and it's going to solve our problem. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But I think it's very important to note that when you are making these strategies or these plans, that you lead with empathy and compassion and really understand that we have a lot of work to do. We have to dismantle systems. We have to address bias, both organizationally and from an individual perspective. That means that we have to get everybody sort of moving in the same direction, but also that means we have to meet people where they are. So, a lot of the kind of stuff that I'm seeing out there, I'm like, this isn't going to help. We can't hammer this stuff down people's throats, right? It has to be done in the right way and really more of an empowering thing where we are saying, you're the culture. You are the 100 employees that make up our culture, and we need to figure out what's going to work for the people that we have here. So now when people leave or new people come in, you have to reevaluate every single time. So it's not like you create the strategy and now you're like, okay, we're done. We figured out our DEI strategy or we figured out our civility strategy. It's an ongoing process and constantly changing too.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the funny thing is like, this is also a great example of why diversity matters, because had the management team brought in a group of diverse opinions before they had this conversation, they probably wouldn't have had this conversation in the first place, right? Totally. And that top-down leadership style is not a good approach when you're dealing with these types of issues.
Yeah, and I wanted to read. I wrote down this quote, and I wanted to read this quote. Okay, This is so important. Is that one of the employees in the article you sent me wrote down, said that They're talking about leadership. They really don't care about what employees say. If they don't think it's an issue, it's not. If they don't experience it themselves, it isn't real. This mindset is just not going to work anymore, because what we've learned this last year is that our tolerance levels have gone down, but they're those things of staying at a job for 2 years because it might look bad on your resume. Nobody cares about that stuff anymore. Nobody cares. Yeah. People care about being treated with dignity and respect. People care about being in a collaborative environment. People care about what they're doing. They want to be purpose driven. They want to feel like their work makes a difference, and they're going to move and go somewhere different if you're not going to be able to provide that. So it's really shifted. Yeah, the way we look at these issues.
Yeah, it's definitely an existential issue for some of these companies as well. One thing that's interesting about this too is that, this is obviously, a kind of contrarian group of guys who wanted to come together and build a company. But what works as a small company with a small group of people doesn't work the same with as a company matures and grows and gets larger and you have more people there with differing opinions. And, I think sometimes when you have new leaders, they tend to think they have the answers, and they kind of insulate themselves with a sort of tight group. And I think in this situation, you saw that there was maybe one person in leadership who was, exhibiting some bad behavior. And because it was such a tight insular group there, that maybe they had a really hard time addressing it with that person, right?
Yeah. It could be that. I mean, it's hard to tell, right? I always take these articles and things with a grain of salt. Like I've learned really, really in my career, I've learned that there's always more facts than what's being reported. But what really bothered me about that was that I didn't, when the one person, the chief product officer, finally spoke up and he made these comments about white supremacy, and we don't really know exactly, there was some dispute about what was actually said.
Right.
But the point being is, where was the leadership during that time? You either need to have that person's back or you need to correct them in that situation. When you're doing a town hall like that in front of all your employees and there's a contentious issue, employees are looking at leadership and saying, which side are you on? And so there was a lot of silence. Like I said, the one person was on mute the whole time, turned his video camera off. And the other one, I don't know if he responded to those or seemed like there was some pushing and pulling going on. But the bottom line is everybody's watching leadership right now. Every single person is watching leadership, and we want transparency. Employees want transparency. And so being a leader is not having all the answers. It's being comfortable with saying, I don't know all the answers, and we're trying to figure this out, and getting feedback from the people, especially the people who are being impacted by this, right? It's easy for someone who doesn't have to deal with, hate in their family, or someone that they're close to who's BIPOC or transgender, who's fighting for basic rights right now. They're not going to understand why I just can't shut that off when I walk into work, right? And so you really have to look at, and I think it's also important too, like in that situation where if a leader like that publicly speaks on behalf of the company, then if they're speaking incorrectly, you got to do that right then and there. That cannot wait. I think respectfully, professionally, one of those leaders should have stepped up and said, we want to have more of these conversations. We really need to talk about why this is important and really kind of work through that difference. Because when you throw around words like white supremacy, that's going to trigger people. That's just a given. So you can't just say, we're not going to have that conversation at all, or it doesn't happen in our culture. It doesn't matter what you say as the white person is a part of it. It matters what everybody else says, right? And so I think we can really learn from that situation. But I think an easy way to have handled that situation was for one of the leaders to just kind of step up and say, hey, you know what? This conversation is so important that we need to have more of these. And so let's figure out when we can come back to the table and maybe have a facilitator come and join us so that we can really get on the same page. Like that would have been a perfect out for them to be able to put the conversation off. It was getting too heated, to put that pause on it, but then to let everybody know that this is serious and we want to be prepared in how we handle it. Right. So,
yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's sort of there's you necessarily have to have a level of maturity and leadership, to do the right things sometimes at these companies, and I think that a lot of companies don't feel that level of maturity is necessary, or it hinders the overall effort, and so they don't go down that road, and I think it's unfortunate, as we can see in this case. So, obviously, and I don't want to pile on these guys because they've got enough bad stuff going on right now, to deal with, right? But what could they have done right? I mean, like, what does good look like?
Yeah, good looks like making sure that when you're drafting policy changes like this, that you get outside advice and create a plan of how to handle it. Like I said, making sure how you communicate it, you look at the impact, you look at the timing, make sure the wording is proper. Okay, so there's a lot of things from the policy perspective with that other list thing that was going on. That seriously, I mean, I don't know how to respond to that. Like, how could that even be allowed in an organization, especially since what we've gone through this last year? If you can't say that you have well intentions for doing something like that. And if you do, you look like a fool.
Right.
There is no well intentions behind having a list like that. So we can't justify that away. That should not have happened, period.
Right.
Right. I also think that there's issues there that are going the opposite direction of what we want. They didn't create a welcoming environment. We need to create welcoming environments where people can bring up these concerns and talk about these issues without fearing retaliation. Everything I read in that article you sent me led me to believe that one employee that was sort of asking questions about the list, was raising these concerns, was like being publicly shamed, was almost being made to feel like he was dramatizing it or overreacting to what was going on. And somewhere in the article, it said something like, and this is where I almost like fell out of my chair when I was reading that article, where it said they actually thought they were creating that list because they were trying to be inclusive.
Yeah, I did not understand that part.
I didn't either. I was like, how is that inclusive? I would love to have a conversation with that person because I don't see how that's inclusive. That's the exact opposite of being inclusive. So for that piece, but the retaliation piece I wanted to just bring up is really important because 3 out of 4 concerns of harassment that happen in the workplace are not being reported because people fear retaliation. So when people are 75% of the problems that are happening are not being brought to management's attention, how can HR, how can the leadership do what it needs to protect their employees? They can't. So we want to create an environment where people have multiple reporting mechanisms. They can report anonymously, they can report online, they can bring up issues without fear of retaliation, where sometimes I might want to talk to somebody about some concern I have, but I'm not looking to have a formal investigation go through. I just want to talk to somebody about it. Let's say it's the microaggression. I don't want to get this person fired, but it is something that's making me feel uncomfortable. And so you need to have different places where people can go for these conversations and not fear like, everything's going to turn into a formal investigation. So there's a lot that we need to look at, especially when we're working virtually as well. But the more that the employer can do to create a welcoming, a psychologically safe environment, then people are going to come with these issues and we can proactively address them. Because if one person brings a concern and now the company looks into it,
yeah,
oftentimes what you find is that one concern is the tip of the iceberg, that there's usually other behaviors, other things going on, not just to this one person, but to other people.
Yeah.
So your job is not just to protect the one employee that makes the complaint, it's to protect everybody. But we can't do that unless people are bringing those concerns forward. So we have to create those environments where people can bring these issues forward.
Yeah. So Sejal, let me ask you a couple questions. Hypothetical scenarios, right? I've been really looking forward to this conversation because, I'm one of those guys that doesn't have the answers, right? And I'm probably a bit of a weenie about having these kind of conversations at work, right? I'm definitely guilty of it. Chris is a little more comfortable. I'm not. In one of your podcasts, you're talking about how when you engage some clients, you first look at their board and you see what kind of diversity they have at the board level. Let's just say a board or executive leadership level. What about the scenario where somebody says, well, we have 6 executives or 5 board members, whatever it is, and everyone is a white male, in those scenarios. But they say, but these were the most qualified people. We didn't have any other candidates that were women or qualified or of diverse background. So how would you advise a company that basically is saying, these were the candidates that we had and we chose the best one, not based upon anything else, but because of we are a meritocracy and that's how we're going about it?
Yeah, and I have plenty of clients that are like that, and my question would be, what are you doing to get more diversity? It's not necessarily who you have there right now, because there are a lot of companies that have told me that, and a lot of companies have said we're trying, but we're just not recruiting. The bottom line is that there is ways that you can look at bias within your hiring process, your recruiting process. Are you casting a broad enough net where are you casting the net? Are you getting people from community colleges? We all know that so it's just a matter of then looking at how do we address who you're bringing in and how, and what can we do to bring in more diversity? And it's not about just bringing them in, but it's also about having it all levels. So it's not just at the board level, but having it at your senior leadership level, at all levels of management. So if you're telling me that you've tried really hard to get board members of diversity, but then I look at the rest of your organization and now everybody at all levels is white, then now we've got a different issue, right? Then I'm questioning your veracity and your credibility and all of these other things. But I'm used to that. So I can give you guidance and we can work through that, because a lot of companies are there. And that's where we have to meet people. Now, I can also very easily tell when someone is saying that I care about diversity and we're doing what we can, but then you look and you see there's no resources behind it. There's no diversity person that's allocated to drive those initiatives. They've got maybe one diversity training per year. There's no unconscious bias training. There's no bystander intervention training. There's a lot of ways to help an organization create this. And it all starts with, very simply, just looking at what are your core values at your organization. How do you define those? Is diversity a core value? Is inclusion a core value? I tell organizations to make civility a core value, right? So if you've got these core values, what are the definitions of those core values? And this is where I work. This is where I tell leadership is, let's start there. Let's figure out what your core values, because it was so frustrating when I would do these leadership trainings and workshops where I would ask senior leadership, what are your core values? And then I get the deer in the headlight look. Mm. If people don't know what their core values are and what the definitions of those are, then how can we make sure the behavior is aligned with those core values?
Yeah.
Right?
I want to loop back for just a second to, something that Sundish said about, hiring board members, and we can't find diverse ones because, we couldn't find anybody who was qualified. And, we talk a lot about data on this podcast, and, this seems like a data problem. Like you have a certain selection bias because you view the set of qualifications very narrowly, right? Mm-hmm. And if one of the sets of qualifications is to understand diverse cultures, then these people weren't ultimately qualified, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a little aspect of this is that when I hear that, I kind of go like, I think you need to evaluate what qualified means, and with that too, and you have to try harder. I mean, that's what I was told that point blank, and it was absolutely right. When I said we didn't have enough women on this podcast and it was hard to get them, I had somebody tell me try harder, and
it's true.
It's true, right?
It's so true. And then the thing about bias, again, we keep coming back to that, right? I don't know if you've seen, there was on YouTube, I use this video when I do my unconscious bias trainings on the name of the person is Jose Zamora. So he put together his resume. He sent it to 50 or so employers, qualified, well-educated employee, and didn't get any responses back. So then he started taking a look at it and saying, what is going on? Why am I not hearing back from these employers? So what he did was he took his name, his first name, and he took out the S. So he changed it from Jose to Joe. Zamora, same name. I mean, besides that, everything else was the same. The resume, everything else, same employers. And now all of a sudden started getting these calls back, right? So that's evidence of bias when you look at Fortune 500 companies, right? You've got like ridiculous, like 30 percentages of more of the CEOs are like 6'2" or taller compared to the less than 4% of the entire United States population. You've got less than 5% of female CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. Don't tell me there aren't qualified women or shorter men that could be leaders, right? So bias is an issue that you literally have to look at. When I talk about dismantling your systems, we have to look at it both from an organizational standpoint and look at every single process where important decisions are being made and evaluate the risk of bias being there. So people now take out people's personal identifying information off their resumes, take out their zip code, because the zip code can tell you a lot about a person, and do blind interviews. You know, there's so much research on this where they started doing the orchestra with behind a screen, and, you know, because they were only hiring, getting men to be on the orchestras. And then when they did it behind closed curtains, now all of a sudden, you know, 50% increase in the number of female musicians they brought on board. So there's ways that we can mitigate it, but it's about making that commitment, and it's got to be every single process. So anywhere where you have a human being who we presume has a brain, who's making a decision, we have to check that for bias, or important decisions, right? We have to check that and evaluate that for bias. And there are tools. There are things that you could do to do that. And then so you have to do it from an organizational standpoint, but you also needed to do it from an individual standpoint. So people need to know from an individual standpoint what their own unconscious biases are, which are normal, right? And then what to do about it when they're at work or when they're not at work.
This is a tough problem to solve, right? I mean, this is, I know we've talked to you before too, and Chris and I've talked, it just seems like a very complicated conversation, problem to solve, especially this time. You know, 2021 is just fueled with all of this tension around racism and everything else. Do you feel like there's more hope with the younger generation now, with the millennials, and just like, I feel, you know, we are the, you know, there's like a changing of the guard happening. We're becoming like that older crew, and there's these younger people that are very much like DIE is just part of their like, you know, everyday life. And so what's your experience on like, you know, us older folks versus like some of the younger guys and gals coming into the workplace?
I definitely think the generational issues, we're already starting to see the multi-generational issues popping up with employers. That's only going to continue, you know, and we're going to see more issues regarding multi-generational age bias. And, you know, but again, I think it's and the millennials, I'm doing this 7-week DEI. I just finished it yesterday, but a 7-week DEI certificate program that was put forth by University of South Florida. And they shared some statistics yesterday that I didn't know. And when I became aware, I was like, wow, the diversity that's coming into the workforce along with the age diversity, you know, if you're not going to be prepared for that, and especially when you look at the spending power of the diversity that's coming in, you know, with the millennials and their spending power, and you've got Latinos and Africans as the majority of the marginalized groups that's coming into the workforce, and they're spending trillions of dollars. If you don't figure out how you're going to support these employees, because a lot of them may not have college educations, but they're still coming into the workforce, so they're going to need different kinds of support. And so we're really looking at, you know, when we're talking about bias, is not looking at bias as far as your job descriptions, who you're looking to hire, where you're getting them from. All of this stuff needs to be addressed proactively, because going back to your question, this is happening, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. And last year kind of just sped things up at like, it went from like, okay, we're cruising along at like 30 miles an hour, and now we're at like 75 miles an hour, right? We're going fast, and it's happening fast. And people's tolerance levels have gone down. So diversity is here to stay. Globalization is here to stay. The multi-generational issues are here to stay. And the quicker that you can get to people first and teaching people the skills, which can be done. And, you know, so yes, it's a complicated problem, very complicated. Unfortunately, we've let it go on for way too long, that it's become sort of the way that we do things. but I 100% believe it can happen. And we start small steps, right? We give people bite-sized strategies. We don't make it all technical. We don't put everything on somebody's plate. We start small. We give them little strategies. Some of these things, like I talk about in my TEDx talk, these are habits that we've had for years. It's going to take some time to address those and mitigate those. And so it's not going to happen overnight. And I don't think anybody out there, is expecting it to, but I think it's decision-making time. Are you going to be on this side, or are you going to be on, I want to go back to being normal, because it's not going to be normal. We're not going back there. Nobody wants to go back there.
Yeah, it's time to change. Right? I think the hard thing is changing minds, and the one thing that I know now at my age and having 3 children and everything else is, God, I was wrong a lot throughout my life. Like I have changed my opinion.
I feel the same way.
I started here on a topic, and then I ended up over here, and it's only through those conversations. Chris and I are great friends, and I'm very thankful for our friendship, because there's nothing off limits, and we will agree to disagree, but also he's helped me see things from a different perspective, and I do think that's a skill that I want to personally get better with, because I'll tell you, for me, this is hugely stressful for me, because I have so much anxiety over trying to have these very difficult conversations, because I'm guilty of it for sure. It's like, to me, I'm a sales guy, right? So to me, it's like, let's just all be nice to each other and live to fight another day, and let's work together and be nice, whatever. I don't know. This is going to be a journey for me, Sejal. You have motivated me, and I appreciate this conversation. Yay. But I might have to call you and be like, hey, this person was being really mean to me. What do I do?
Well, I'm just going to say one thing to what you said. It's not about changing minds. And that's the thing. It's keep that in mind. We're not trying to change people's minds. What we're trying to do is change their behavior, right? We are not, because there are people that are not going to change their minds, and that's okay. We're not. It literally is about changing what is acceptable behavior. And so research shows that if we focus in on changing behavior, which is why I go at it from the civility angle, that if we change behavior, then research says over time, the person will also change their beliefs, their opinions, and so forth. Wonderful. But at a minimum, we got to make sure we change the behavior. So things like creating a list based on employees, customers' names because they're Asian or African, that is not acceptable behavior. I don't care who you are. Right. And so that's where I'm focused in on, because ultimately civility is a choice. We make that every single day with every interaction that we have with everybody. Right? I don't think there's a person in the world that would disagree with me, is that we all want to be treated with dignity and respect when we're at work. Right. So part of that also, though, is it's not enough to just say I'm treated that way, but I also need to know, because as bystanders, if that's happening to somebody else at work, what do I do in that situation? Because we can't be complicit. We can't allow it to go on. So, there could be different opinions. People can have opposing views, and that's okay. But we have to all make a commitment that even when that's happening, we're still going to treat each other respectfully. We're going to get to it. We're going to make time. We're going to be present with each other to have a conversation, have a dialogue, not a debate, and get to our shared understanding, which at work is your core values. So we're really trying to just align behavior with core values, which is what we should have been doing from day one.
Well, I got to say, I've learned a lot, certainly, from this conversation, because there are things that I, like you say, it's about behavior, not changing minds, and I think that's a really good place to start. So tell me what's next for you. I mean, you got a ton of cool stuff going on. So tell me what's coming up for you.
So I've got a couple of exciting things that are going on. One of, that I'm getting involved with the venture studio, Nobody Studios. We're going to be having a conversation with Mark McNally, the CEO, pretty soon. But that's really exciting. It's an area it's a space that I'm not familiar with. I've never been in the startup or venture studio space. And so I'm learning a lot as I'm sort of taking on this role. And I just joked the other day because they said some term that apparently everybody in the startup world would know. And I'm like, are you sure you still want to bring me back? Because I don't even know the definition of that term, but I know culture. And so that's what I'm going to bring to the table is how do we create the better culture? So Nobody Studios is something that's really exciting that's going on. And as the other part, the other thing I'll say is, I'm working on an initiative right now where, as you know, I'm very passionate about bias. That's what my TEDx talk was about. But I really think that bias is in all the systems, right? It's everywhere. But I'm focusing my efforts right now on the healthcare industry and how do we address bias there, because the statistics are scary about people of color, Black people, marginalized groups not getting healthcare and treatment the way they should because of that. And so that's just an area that's very close to my heart. So I'm driving an initiative. I'm reaching out to healthcare administrators. So if anybody's listening to this and you have any decision-making authority about it's, there's a law that was passed in California that said that doctors and nurses have to get trained in implicit bias by next year. But anybody that touches a patient from top to bottom, anyone in healthcare administration, in my opinion, should receive this training. The other part of that, too, is because we rely so heavily on AI. And if your AI is biased, then that's going to result in all this. So, I'm trying to do what I can to raise awareness on unconscious bias because it's so important and people just don't really understand it. And I think that's really preventing us from making progress towards true inclusion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you are really doing the good work here. So, I'm just going to thank you for doing that. But it's amazing stuff. And I think, you did a great TEDx talk that I'll put a link to in the show notes. You certainly taught me a lot on this conversation. I think that one of the most important things that you said today is that you have to deal with this before it's a problem. And so if people wanted to reach out to you to get that kind of help, how would they do that? And what would you be able to do for them?
Sure. So the best way to get a hold of me is on LinkedIn. That's the only social media platform I'm on. So I have made it a personal mission to find good information that's actually helpful on these topics that we've talked about here today, because there's so much stuff out there that, I really want to help create better cultures. So I look for that information and I share it. So follow me on LinkedIn, my company website that says like all the stuff that I'm doing. You can contact me through my company website. And I'm a huge, if I can't help you in the stuff that I'm doing, I'm very happy to introduce you to somebody within my network. So if you're dealing with something you're not sure, diversity and inclusion, I don't know where to get started, or I don't know, some days you're welcome to call me if you're dealing with one of those situations and you're not sure what to do, right? But I'm always welcome people just reaching out to me, because there are some people that don't want to do that work, right? They're saying it's not my job, it's not my responsibility, and that's okay. I don't mind, because I want to move us in that direction, right? So those would be the ways to contact me.
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier that you sometimes feel more like a therapist. And I was thinking, wow, lawyers should be cross-trained as therapists, because sometimes what we need more than a lawsuit is a little bit of therapy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So right on, spot on for that. Exactly. Well, Sejal, I just want to say thanks so much for being on. This is really a super important topic. I think you've shed a great deal of light on how to deal with these things. And, I appreciate the work that you're doing out there. And thank you so much for being on. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And thank you for all those kind comments too.
Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, click on that like button, hit that subscribe button, because that helps the channel a ton. And if you want to get notified when we post new content, click on that bell icon and you will get notified. And I will see you in the next video.